The streets of Richmond buzzed with the heavy clatter of wagons, the sharp calls of auctioneers, and the stench of sweat and smoke. Merchants shouted their wares, while buyers, draped in the finery of wealth, leaned over the railings of the auction block, calculating the worth of human lives as if they were bales of cotton. Among them, whispers circulated of a young woman whose value had surpassed that of any man or woman ever brought to the city. Gold coins and notes had been counted, recounted, and stacked, but none could justify the price she carried, not merely for her beauty, nor for her strength, nor for the promise of obedience, but for the secret that had made her priceless. Her name was Eleanor, though few would speak it aloud. She was 19, with hair the color of dark honey, eyes like storm clouds ready to burst, and a presence so commanding that even the most hardened traders paused in awe. Her frame, slender yet resilient, had been shaped by years of fieldwork, yet it was her mind, sharp, calculating, and fearless, that made her more than a possession. They did not yet know why she had been valued above all others, why buyers had competed as if trying to outbid death itself. The secret she carried was dangerous, unpredictable, and capable of unraveling the lives of anyone who sought to claim her. At the auction block, the crowd grew silent as Eleanor was led forward, her wrists bound lightly, her posture unyielding. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cracking slightly with excitement, "this is a rare opportunity. Never before has one slave drawn such a sum. Never before has one carried such promise or peril." A murmur ran through the spectators. Some laughed, some leaned closer, some shivered. The rich and powerful had been charmed by her looks before, but now something else lingered in the air. The sense that she knew more than she should, that she could manipulate more than she appeared capable of. Bids rose, climbing higher than anyone had anticipated. Gold changed hands, pockets were emptied, and fortunes were risked, all for a chance to own Eleanor. Yet no one guessed what her owner would discover within days, that she was not merely a slave, but a force of reckoning. The day she was claimed by a wealthy planter named Josiah Caraway, Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes observing every detail of her new surroundings. His estate was massive, sprawling with whitewashed fences, the river gleaming in the sunlight beyond the cane fields. Josiah believed he had purchased obedience, submission, and the pride of owning the finest property. He did not know she had already learned the layout of his mind before even stepping onto the porch. Inside the great house, Eleanor was shown her quarters, a modest room at the end of the servants' hall, close enough to hear every whispered conversation, far enough to be overlooked. She listened carefully as the house servants went about their duties, noting alliances, rivalries, and secrets. She memorized faces and gestures, cataloging everything that might be useful. That night, she lay on the narrow cot, the faint moonlight streaming through the shuttered windows, and considered the truth. Her price had not been for beauty, strength, or obedience. It had been for a secret hidden deep in her past, one she had kept hidden even from herself until the time was right. By morning, the new household would awaken to a presence they could not yet comprehend. Eleanor moved silently through the corridors, her bare feet soundless on the polished boards, and observed Josiah as he drank coffee in the sunroom. He was confident, dismissive, and arrogant, unaware that the treasure he had acquired was not what it seemed. She could sense it in the way he held his shoulders, in the careless flick of his wrist, in the faintest trace of fear when he glanced at the cane fields. The slaves who had watched Eleanor arrive whispered among themselves, sensing the shift. They saw the way she carried herself, the way her gaze penetrated the corners of the room, the way her mind seemed to unravel the unspoken rules of the house. They could not yet understand the depth of the secret she possessed, a secret that would soon terrify, manipulate, and ultimately transform every life on the Caraway plantation. That evening, Eleanor stepped onto the veranda overlooking the river. The wind teased her hair and carried with it the distant sounds of the city, the clatter of coins, the cries of traders, the laughter of men who thought they had won her. She smiled faintly, knowing that by the next dawn, the Caraway family's notions of control, power, and ownership would begin to crumble. Her value, calculated in gold, was nothing compared to the truth she would reveal, a truth so terrifying, so inescapable, that it would haunt the plantation for decades to come. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the river in shades of fire and blood, Eleanor understood one immutable fact. She was no longer a commodity. She was the reckoning. The dawn broke slow and heavy over the caraway plantation, draping the fields in a pale, misty light. Eleanor had already risen, her eyes scanning the horizon, her mind threading together the possibilities that each day could hold. She moved with precision through the quarters, gathering small details: which slaves were loyal to Josiah, which ones whispered in corners, which carried fear like a shadow behind their steps. Knowledge was her currency now, far more potent than the gold that had exchanged hands for her at the auction. Josiah Caraway, the proud owner, had taken his breakfast in the sunroom, unaware that his prized acquisition was far more observant than he could have imagined. He watched Eleanor as she emerged from the hallways with a tray of water and clean cloths. Her posture was immaculate, her expression calm, yet there was an intensity in her eyes that unnerved him, though he could not place why. She appeared to submit, yet every movement seemed measured, deliberate, as though she were mapping his mind as much as his house. Eleanor's secret, the very reason she had commanded such an extraordinary price, was not magic, nor charm, nor mere cunning. It was a knowledge of human weakness, a reading of the body and soul so precise that she could anticipate reactions before they happened. She had learned to manipulate perception, to bend people subtly, and to make them act according to her designs without a single word. It had taken years of survival in markets, plantations, and traveling auction houses to cultivate this skill. But now, in Caraway's house, the time for subtlety would soon shift into action. Her first move came with a simple gesture. She approached the kitchen, where the cook and two younger slaves prepared the morning meal. Eleanor smiled faintly, speaking softly. "He will not eat what he has before him if you add the pepper from the small jar," she instructed. The cook, a nervous woman named Marietta, hesitated, glancing at Eleanor suspiciously, but the younger boys, intimidated by her presence, obeyed. Soon, Josiah would taste the subtle alteration, a hint of bitterness that would gnaw at him, forcing unease he could not explain. Eleanor's lips curved in a faint, satisfied smile. By mid-morning, Eleanor began expanding her influence. She lingered near the stables, observing the overseers, noting their moods and habits. She learned which men were cruel and predictable, which had hidden vices, and which could be persuaded to bend for the right incentive. Her eyes, stormy and unreadable, took in every twitch of a mouth, every hesitation in a movement, and she committed them all to memory. These details were not trivial. They were the first threads in a web that would soon entangle every life on the plantation. Meanwhile, Josiah, convinced of his own superiority, patrolled the fields with a cane in hand, ensuring that work progressed as expected. He did not notice Eleanor slipping through the shadows, listening to whispered complaints, counting each gesture of fear or defiance. What he could not see, and what terrified him in ways he would soon discover, was that Eleanor already knew the secrets of his estate better than he did. By noon, whispers had begun among the slaves. Eleanor's presence was magnetic yet terrifying. She spoke to them in private corners, advising subtly, giving warnings cloaked as guidance. Some felt uneasy, some were intrigued. No one knew the full extent of her insight, but all understood one thing. Eleanor could see into the hidden fears of men, and perhaps into their darkest thoughts. It was during this afternoon, while Josiah dozed briefly under the shade of a magnolia tree, that Eleanor enacted the first overt demonstration of her power. She had noticed his habitual impatience, the twitch in his left hand when annoyed, the way he licked his lips when he was about to speak in anger. She exploited these traits carefully, slipping a folded note into his pocket that suggested disloyalty among the overseers, planting tiny observations that made him question his own household's loyalty. By the time he awoke, the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it grew fast. By evening, Josiah was restless. The household seemed quieter, colder. His prized property, Eleanor, moved about calmly, attending to tasks with diligence, yet her very calmness was a source of unease. She watched him as he paced in the study, eyes narrowing, muttering to himself. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. He was beginning to taste the effect of her subtle manipulations. The slaves, sensing the change, began to whisper more freely about Eleanor's capabilities. Was it wisdom? Was it sorcery? None could be sure, but all understood that she was not merely a commodity, nor a servant. She was a force that could disrupt power with precision. That night, as Eleanor retired to her quarters, the sounds of the estate seemed altered, strained, tense, charged with expectation. In the quiet of the moonlit room, Eleanor allowed herself a single thought. The plantation, with all its wealth, authority, and brutality, was now hers to observe, influence, and eventually control. Her secret, her terrifying and priceless knowledge of human nature, had already begun to bend reality to her will. And Josiah Carraway, who had paid handsomely for her, would soon realize that the price he had paid was nothing compared to the consequences that were coming. The dawn of the next day promised new challenges, and Eleanor was ready, patient, calculating, and merciless in her patience. The true value of Virginia's most prized slave was about to be revealed in ways no one on the plantation would ever forget. The morning air carried a subtle chill as Eleanor stepped from the slave quarters into the sun-smeared fields. Mist hovered over the crops, and the distant cries of workers carried faintly, almost like a rhythm she could follow. She had spent the previous day learning the intricate habits of every soul on the plantation, and now she began the second phase of her plan, the gentle unraveling of authority from within. Josiah Carraway had awoken in an inexplicable malaise. The note Eleanor had planted, combined with the subtle manipulations of small, unnoticed incidents, had worked like a slow poison. He eyed his overseers with suspicion, misinterpreted innocent glances as conspiracies, and murmured to himself about loyalty he could no longer trust. Eleanor had studied these tendencies carefully. Josiah had a hair-trigger mind, a thirst for control that outstripped his patience. She would exploit it meticulously, shaping the estate according to her design without ever revealing herself as the architect. Eleanor moved first toward the kitchen. The cook, Marietta, now clearly under her influence, approached with trepidation, carrying the morning's preparations. Eleanor's voice was calm but firm. Use the small knife with the lye, and grind the pepper more finely. Let the taste linger, but only slightly. Marietta obeyed, hands trembling. Not because she understood the full intent, but because Eleanor's presence commanded obedience. The simple alteration would unsettle Josiah during breakfast, planting discomfort and uncertainty before the day had fully begun. Next, Eleanor navigated the fields. She stopped near the overseers, her eyes catching subtle signs, the twitch of a finger, the clench of a jaw, the way one man's glance darted toward a worker who had dropped a tool. She memorized each movement, cataloging fears, impulses, and weaknesses. Knowledge was her weapon, and she wielded it silently. Even the workers who labored under her gaze felt a strange tension. Some whispered that she seemed to anticipate their every move, a silent observer who weighed their worth with invisible scales. Midday arrived, and Eleanor turned her attention to Josiah himself. He paced in the sunroom, fuming over minor slights and imagined treacheries. She had noted the small, telltale gestures, the tapping of his cane when irritated, the slight flare of his nostrils when confronted with stress, the way he adjusted his waistcoat when uncertain. She knew exactly how to manipulate him, which words to plant, which actions to provoke, and she did so carefully, making him believe that the shifts in loyalty and tension were entirely organic. Her next move involved the plantation's younger slaves, those more impressionable and easily guided. She whispered in their ears about watching eyes, about consequences they could not understand fully, weaving a subtle fear into their actions. These small, barely noticeable seeds would bloom into confusion and unease within the ranks of the laborers, indirectly challenging Josiah's control without any overt confrontation. By late afternoon, the effects were undeniable. Josiah's mood had soured. Even his closest allies, the overseers, hesitated in his presence. He suspected plots where there were none, grew angry over perceived disrespect, and questioned decisions he had previously taken for granted. Eleanor observed all this from a distance, her calm demeanor a mask for the calculation beneath. Every move, every misstep, every twitch of doubt in Josiah's posture reinforced her growing influence over the plantation. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky bled red over the horizon, Eleanor returned to her quarters. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The day had been a success. Subtle manipulations, invisible to most eyes, had begun to fracture the authority of the man who had purchased her. Her price, her extraordinary value, had been proven not in wealth, but in her ability to wield perception and insight as weapons far deadlier than any whip or chain. In the dim glow of candlelight, Eleanor reviewed the day in her mind. She would continue, step by step, turning the plantation into a place where fear and obedience could be directed as she wished. The overseers, the workers, even Josiah himself would all become instruments of her design. And all the while, the secret that had made her so desirable, her uncanny ability to understand and manipulate human nature, remained hidden behind a mask of compliance and subservience. As the night deepened, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the days ahead. Subtlety would remain her ally, patience her weapon, and observation her shield. By the time Josiah realized the depth of her influence, it would be too late. The most valuable slave in Virginia had already begun her quiet conquest. The following morning, the plantation stirred beneath a heavy, gray sky. Eleanor awoke before dawn, her senses sharp and alert, as though the very air carried messages only she could read. From her small, neatly kept quarters, she could hear the faint murmur of the workers, the occasional cough or scrape of a shovel against soil, and the subtle creak of Josiah Carraway pacing above in the main house. Each sound was a thread, weaving a tapestry of tension she intended to unravel. Breakfast was the first stage of the day's manipulation. Eleanor moved with quiet precision, passing the dishes and offering guidance that seemed innocent, even customary. Yet each suggestion was calculated to unsettle. A pinch more salt here, a slightly uneven pour of tea there, tiny disturbances that would gnaw at Josiah's sense of control. As he ate, his hand trembled over the silverware, though no one else noticed. The overseers exchanged uneasy glances, and the younger slaves flinched under the weight of the silent unease Eleanor had sown. Once the meal concluded, Eleanor slipped into the fields. The laborers, many of whom had started to sense her unusual insight, gave her cautious, respectful nods. She smiled faintly, recognizing the power she held over their attention. In a gentle, almost imperceptible way, she began issuing instructions that seemed benign but carried consequences. Workers were told to adjust the irrigation channels slightly differently, to plant the seedlings in rows offset from the usual pattern. To Josiah, this would seem like minor errors or oversights, small failings to be frustrated over, but Eleanor knew the ripple effects these decisions would have on the productivity of the plantation. It was subtle sabotage, executed with patience and grace. By mid-morning, Josiah emerged to inspect the fields, his eyes scanning the crops with an anxious, calculating gaze. Eleanor allowed herself a discreet step back, watching him frown and mutter under his breath as he noticed the irregularities she had orchestrated. The overseers, usually confident in their authority, looked uncertain, sensing the tension in Josiah and in the workers alike. Eleanor, cloaked in obedience, was the eye in the storm, her influence invisible yet undeniable. The true test of her control came during the midday meal, where she observed the interactions among the household staff. Eleanor subtly shifted loyalties with whispered words and small, seemingly casual gestures. A compliment here, a cautious correction there, and the subtle hierarchy of obedience began to tilt, with Josiah's authority wavering like a candle in the wind. Even the housekeeper, a woman of years and experience, looked toward Eleanor with a mixture of respect and fear, recognizing that the young slave's counsel carried weight that no one else could command. In the late afternoon, Eleanor moved again among the fields. She had noticed a disagreement brewing between two overseers over the placement of the tobacco plants. With a quiet word to each, she nudged their argument to escalate subtly, keeping her hands clean while allowing the chaos to spread. Josiah, when he arrived to check on the progress, found himself frustrated not by one overt act of disobedience, but by the cumulative effect of countless small disturbances he could neither anticipate nor fully understand. His mind spun with irritation, his confidence eroding with each misstep he discovered. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the fields, Eleanor returned to her quarters. She paused briefly at a window, watching Josiah fume, muttering accusations that found no target. The young slave allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Her strategy was working. The plantation was subtly fracturing from within, her influence growing without a single overt confrontation. She had become both shadow and storm, her secret weapon not brute force but a mind keenly attuned to human nature. Night fell, bringing the cool hush of darkness over the estate. Eleanor lit a small candle, taking a moment to plan the next day's moves. She would continue to exploit the fears, jealousies, and insecurities of those around her, guiding the plantation into a state where obedience to her suggestions would become second nature. Josiah's authority was weakening, and soon he would no longer recognize who truly held the power in his estate. As she closed her eyes for a few hours of rest, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the greater goal she had set for herself. The secret behind her extraordinary value, the insight, cunning, and patience that made her the most sought-after slave in Virginia, was no longer just a personal advantage. It had become a weapon capable of reshaping the lives of everyone on the plantation, of twisting the very foundations of wealth, power, and control. And in the quiet of the night, she allowed herself a single thought. By the time Josiah realized the full scope of her influence, it would be too late for him to resist. The next morning, Eleanor rose before the sun, her movements silent and deliberate. Even in the dim gray light of dawn, she seemed to command attention simply by existing within the household. The house stirred slowly, Josiah Carraway's restless pacing, the faint clatter of boots on the back stairs, and the whispers of younger slaves barely awake, but Eleanor's presence created an unspoken gravity. No one moved without the weight of her gaze, even when it was hidden behind the soft veil of obedience. Breakfast was a controlled performance. Eleanor positioned herself near the master's table, attending to his needs while planting subtle seeds of doubt in his mind. The sugar in his tea was slightly bitter, the butter on the biscuits spread unevenly, and she suggested, in the gentlest tone, that a certain overseer had mishandled the garden beds. Josiah, ever eager to assert authority, furrowed his brow and glared toward the overseer. Eleanor's eyes, calm and unwavering, followed his reaction, noting how quickly tension rippled through the room. After breakfast, Eleanor moved among the fields. Today, she had a new plan: to manipulate both workers and overseers without ever touching a single crop. She whispered a small correction to one laborer, then a subtle warning to another, setting them at odds over the placement of seedlings. The overseers, already on edge from yesterday's disturbances, bickered quietly under their breaths, and Eleanor observed the disarray grow, each step executed with precision. Her instructions seemed routine, even helpful, but the effects were anything but. Josiah arrived mid-morning to inspect the work. His eyes scanned the uneven rows, the misplaced irrigation channels, and the subtly shifted seedlings. He muttered to himself, his authority wavering with every inconsistency he noticed. Eleanor, feigning concern, approached him and quietly offered suggestions. Each one seemed harmless, practical, and even loyal, but they deepened the confusion. Josiah left the fields in frustration, unaware that the very guidance he had received was part of Eleanor's strategy. By midday, Eleanor had turned her attention back to the household staff. The maids, cooks, and other slaves were watching her with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. A simple word, a smile, a carefully timed gesture, each reinforced the subtle power she wielded over their actions. Instructions given in her softest voice carried the weight of command, and obedience followed without question. She began to orchestrate the hierarchy quietly, rewarding loyalty and planting seeds of mistrust in those who might challenge her growing influence. In the late afternoon, Eleanor intercepted Josiah again. He had summoned 2 overseers to discuss a minor dispute, but Eleanor, moving with quiet grace, inserted herself into the conversation. Her input appeared innocent, even deferential, but each suggestion she offered ensured that arguments simmered and control slipped further from Josiah's grasp. The overseers, normally confident, looked to Eleanor as a source of clarity, unaware that their confusion was exactly what she intended. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, Eleanor returned to her quarters. The day's work was subtle but decisive. The plantation's operations were faltering under the illusion of routine. Josiah's authority weakened while Eleanor's influence solidified. She sat by the window, reviewing her plans for the next day. The power she held her secret intellect, patience, and insight was transforming the estate in ways no one could yet perceive. Night fell, bringing shadows and silence. Eleanor lit a small candle and began recording her observations in a hidden notebook. Each shift in behavior, each tremor of fear or hesitation, was carefully noted. She plotted the next stages: strategic alliances, deliberate mistakes, and gentle manipulations that would continue to erode Josiah's control. As she prepared to sleep, Eleanor felt the weight of her secret fully. Her value, her knowledge, and her calculated patience were no longer just about survival, they were about dominion. By the time Josiah realized the truth, the plantation would no longer be his to command. Eleanor allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Her plan was no longer theory, it was unfolding. And in the quiet of the night, she whispered to herself, "Soon, everything will bend to me." The morning air carried the faint scent of tobacco and damp earth as Eleanor stepped from her quarters. The plantation seemed ordinary at first glance, but Eleanor knew better. Every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the oaks, was part of a larger rhythm she understood and exploited. Today, she would advance her plan further beyond the fields, beyond the household staff, directly into the life of Josiah Carraway himself. She started with small gestures, subtle and seemingly accidental. In the kitchen, she noticed that Josiah's favorite cup had a slight chip and quietly suggested it be replaced. He accepted the advice, trusting her eyes and her counsel without suspicion. At breakfast, she smiled in just the right way, whispered a carefully chosen word, and made sure a minor error in the servants' arrangement caught Josiah's attention. Each moment was calculated to reinforce her presence as indispensable, to make her invisible power undeniable. By mid-morning, Eleanor was walking the rows near the overseer's quarters. Today's task was a delicate one: manipulating information. 2 overseers had begun to quarrel over yesterday's assignments. Eleanor approached, ostensibly neutral, and casually mentioned subtle discrepancies, planting ideas that neither overseer could fully verify. Arguments simmered, tension grew, and the overseers instinctively looked to her for clarification. She smiled, benign and composed, while the plantation's daily operations increasingly depended on her guidance, even though she had orchestrated the disarray herself. It was during the late morning that she turned her attention to Josiah's private life. He was seated on the porch, reviewing the ledgers that dictated the plantation's income and expenditures. Eleanor approached quietly, carrying a tray of papers she had found in the storeroom. As she handed them to him, she let her fingers brush against his, a touch so fleeting it could be denied, but enough to plant a seed of curiosity in his mind. Her eyes met his briefly, calm, knowing, and he felt an unfamiliar unease, a tiny crack in his otherwise rigid authority. Josiah looked at her, puzzled, and asked softly, "How do you know all this?" Eleanor only smiled and shrugged. "I observe, master," she replied, her voice sweet, almost deferential. "Sometimes noticing what others overlook can be useful." He nodded slowly, unease lingering, as though he realized, without understanding fully, that Eleanor's insight extended far beyond any ordinary slave. By noon, Eleanor had orchestrated yet another subtle disruption. She allowed a minor mishap to occur near the stables, an overturned cart, a tangle of ropes, and ensured it was reported in a way that subtly suggested the overseer's negligence. Josiah's anger flared, but he also hesitated, unsure who to blame. Eleanor's calm presence offered reassurance. her soft suggestions guiding him toward decisions that ultimately reinforced her control. Afternoon descended, and Eleanor moved through the house once more. She paused at the door of the mistress's sitting room, noting a draft that might upset the fine fabrics. She called for a servant, instructed them gently, and then retreated with a faint smile. Every act, every gesture, was part of her strategy, to make herself indispensable, trusted, and yet invisible in her growing influence. As the day waned, she found Josiah alone in the study. The ledgers lay open, and his brow furrowed with the weight of minor but accumulating errors. Eleanor approached, speaking softly. "Sometimes the smallest details make the biggest difference, Master. Perhaps you should rest before making further decisions." He paused, listening to her calm, precise voice, realizing only dimly that he relied on her guidance more than he would admit. Night fell, and Eleanor returned to her quarters. She sat by the window, reviewing her observations of the day, recording each response, each hesitation, each subtle shift of power. Every interaction with Josiah, every manipulation of his perception, had created cracks in his authority that would widen over time. The plantation, seemingly ordinary, was bending to her control not through overt rebellion, but through calculated patience, observation, and intellect. As the candlelight flickered, Eleanor allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. The plan was unfolding exactly as intended. Josiah trusted her, depended on her, and yet understood nothing of her true power. The balance of control had shifted, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably. She leaned back, hands folded, a small, victorious smile curling her lips. The night was hers, the plantation hers, and soon, the future of everyone on Caraway land would bend entirely to her design. Eleanor whispered into the quiet darkness, "Soon, everything will be mine to command." The dawn broke soft and gray over Caraway Plantation, but the calm of morning was deceptive. Eleanor moved through the grounds like a shadow, observing, listening, calculating. She had spent weeks cultivating subtle influence over Josiah, the overseers, and even the household staff. Today, she would begin to consolidate that power, turn the invisible threads she had spun into chains that could bind the entire plantation to her will. She began at the stables, where the horses were fed and groomed. The lead stable hand, a man with a tendency toward arrogance, had been increasingly careless under her gentle manipulations. Eleanor watched him fumble with the harnesses, her eyes noting every slight hesitation, every repeated mistake. She stepped forward, offering a simple correction in a soft voice, almost as if by accident. The man straightened immediately, grateful, unaware that his authority had subtly eroded in her presence. He now relied on her advice, her guidance, for things he had once handled with certainty. From there, Eleanor moved into the field, where she observed the laborers. She whispered encouragements to one, a nudge to another, orchestrating minor disputes and then offering resolutions. Her presence became a center of order in an otherwise chaotic hierarchy. The plantation's operations depended more and more on her discretion, and she relished the knowledge that she had achieved this without a single overt command. By mid-morning, she approached the overseer's quarters. She had been sowing seeds of mistrust between them over the past days, highlighting small lapses and exaggerating minor errors in tone and glance. Now the quarrels were flaring. Eleanor stood at a discreet distance, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. The overseers began to turn to her for advice, mediation, and guidance, even as they failed to recognize that their unity and authority were slipping under her careful orchestration. Josiah, meanwhile, was in the main house, reviewing ledgers with a furrowed brow. Eleanor entered under the guise of reporting a minor discrepancy in the accounts. She spoke softly, her tone confident yet deferential, offering corrections that drew his attention. He followed her guidance unquestioningly, relying on her insight. Her control over his perception of competence, over the trust he placed in her, was now undeniable. Every decision he made reinforced her presence and, unknowingly, her authority. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the plantation, and Eleanor returned to the quarters of the household staff. She had carefully cultivated loyalty here as well, rewarding obedience, subtly punishing defiance with withdrawal or silent judgment. Staff members now approached her for direction in small matters, elevating her influence quietly but thoroughly. As dusk approached, Eleanor entered the master's study once again. Josiah looked up from the ledgers, tension creasing his face. "Eleanor," he said, "how do you know so much about this?" Her response was gentle, almost innocent. "I observe, Master. I notice what others overlook." His brow furrowed, a flicker of unease passing through his eyes, though he did not question her further. By now, her power extended across every domain of the plantation. The fields, the stables, the overseers, the household staff, and, most importantly, Josiah himself. Each step of her plan had been precise, each interaction calculated. The web she had woven was now fully operative. What remained was the final stage, leveraging this control to secure the plantation entirely under her influence, ensuring that no decision, no action, could occur without her subtle but unassailable presence. As night fell, Eleanor returned to her quarters, her mind reviewing the day's successes. She had achieved control over men who had thought themselves masters, over laborers who had thought themselves unbroken, over a household that had dismissed her as merely a slave. The balance had shifted. The threads of influence she had spun were now the ropes by which she could guide, manipulate, and, if necessary, dominate every life on Caraway land. She lit a candle and sat by the window, the plantation silent outside. Her eyes glimmered in the flame. "Soon," she whispered to herself, "everything will bend to me. The land, the men, the legacy, they will all belong to me," without them ever realizing it. And in that silence, Eleanor allowed herself the smallest, coldest smile. The final phase of her plan was approaching, and nothing, not threats, not tradition, not fear, would stop her from taking what she had earned with patience, intelligence, and relentless precision. The night belonged to her. Tomorrow, the plantation would belong to her as well. The following morning, the plantation awoke to an uncanny stillness. Birds hesitated in their songs, and even the wind seemed to pause as if to watch. Eleanor moved among the fields, her gait calm, yet every step carried a quiet authority. She no longer needed to whisper instructions. Her presence alone was command enough. Workers and overseers alike instinctively deferred to her judgment, even when it ran contrary to Josiah's own desires. Josiah, unaware of the depth of her influence, rose from his bed with a sense of unease he could not identify. The ledgers and accounts lay before him, yet every decision he made now seemed filtered through Eleanor's subtle manipulations. It was not defiance, he feared it was doubt, the creeping sensation that he no longer held sway over his own plantation. Eleanor approached him quietly in the study, holding a small bundle of papers. "Master," she said, her voice soft yet imbued with a confidence that belied her station. "I reviewed the accounts overnight. Some debts and ledgers have been misaligned. I've taken the liberty of correcting them." Josiah glanced at the corrections and found them precise, beyond reproach. "How did you—" His voice trailed off. "I observed, sir," Eleanor replied with a serene smile. "You trust me to notice what others overlook, do you not?" He nodded, though a slight frown creased his forehead. The realization gnawed at him. He relied upon her more than he could admit. The plantation's operations, once solely his, now depended on her insight. She was no longer a slave in his eyes. She was a necessity, an unseen hand guiding the entire estate. By midday, Eleanor had convened a subtle gathering in the servants' quarters. She spoke softly to the overseers, subtly emphasizing loyalty and efficiency, planting seeds of fear that would guide their decisions without their knowledge. Every comment, every gesture, reinforced her control. Those who resisted found themselves subtly undermined, misinformed, or embarrassed in public, while those who complied were praised with a quiet authority that made them feel indispensable to the plantation's success. In the fields, the laborers moved under her watchful eye, working efficiently, not out of fear, but out of respect. Eleanor had learned that control through influence was stronger than control through punishment. A whispered suggestion could steer more than a lash ever could. As afternoon waned, Eleanor returned to the main house. Josiah had called her again, ostensibly for advice on the allocation of labor and the management of his crops. She approached him with calm deliberation, offering guidance that was simultaneously deferential and assertive. Each recommendation subtly reinforced her presence and authority. "What do you think, Eleanor?" Josiah asked, scanning the plan she had sketched on a piece of parchment. He leaned forward, trusting her assessment more than his own instincts. "I believe this approach will optimize production while minimizing risk, Master," she replied, her tone measured. "If you allow me to oversee its implementation, you will see the results immediately." Josiah hesitated, a flicker of doubt passing through him. But he nodded, surrendering authority to her in that quiet, almost imperceptible way that she had been cultivating for months. It was subtle, but absolute. Eleanor's influence now eclipsed his. By nightfall, Eleanor's plan reached its apex. She had ensured that every decision, every task, every operation of the plantation flowed through her guidance. Overseers deferred to her, workers followed her lead, and even Josiah unconsciously sought her counsel in matters both minor and significant. Sitting alone in the study, Eleanor reviewed the day's progress. The plantation's structure had shifted imperceptibly, but completely. She was no longer merely a participant in the daily routines, she was the fulcrum around which the entire estate turned. Her patience, her observation, and her subtle manipulations had brought her to the pinnacle of control. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, whispering like a secret shared only with her. Eleanor allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Tomorrow, she thought, the true test would come not of influence, but of legacy. For now, however, she could rest in the knowledge that she had bent the world of Caraway Plantation to her will, and that no one, least of all Josiah, suspected the full extent of her power. Her gaze lingered on the moonlit fields. The night was hers. The plantation was hers. And soon, she would ensure that even the whispers of her control were felt in every corner of the estate. Years passed, and the Caraway Plantation transformed under Eleanor's unseen hand. Where once chaos, fear, and rigid hierarchy had dominated, now there was a quiet order that none but Eleanor fully understood. The laborers worked with a careful rhythm, overseers moved efficiently yet cautiously, and Josiah Caraway, though still the official master, had become a shadow in the very house he owned. The plantation functioned as Eleanor wished, and everyone complied, some out of respect, many out of fear, all unaware of the subtle threads guiding every motion. Eleanor, by now a woman of remarkable composure, had perfected the art of influence. She no longer needed to issue orders in the traditional sense. Her suggestions, gestures, and even glances carried authority that people obeyed instinctively. Outsiders who visited the plantation commented on the uncanny efficiency of the estate, the way every operation seemed synchronized as if the land itself had a mind. None could pinpoint the cause. None could guess that a single woman, once purchased for a price lower than her true worth, controlled the rhythm of Caraway life. Her strategies had evolved beyond mere survival. Eleanor began observing the neighboring plantations, quietly noting patterns of labor, dispute, and mismanagement. Letters were subtly intercepted and rewritten. Reports altered just enough to shift attention or favor where she deemed necessary. Business dealings were influenced by whispered words to the right ears. By the time she was middle-aged, Eleanor had achieved something extraordinary, a network of influence that stretched far beyond the boundaries of Caraway land, without ever appearing to intervene directly. Josiah, increasingly dependent on her guidance, began to attribute the plantation's prosperity to luck, good crops, and careful management, but not to Eleanor. He never fully realized that the true intelligence behind the operation was her. To him, she was a loyal servant, invaluable in ways he could not articulate, yet he remained blissfully ignorant of the subtle dominion she exercised. Among the laborers, Eleanor's name became a mixture of reverence and fear. Stories of her insight, her uncanny ability to foresee events, and her quiet mastery circulated in hushed tones. Some whispered that she could predict the weather, read the intentions of visitors, or even know the private thoughts of the overseers. Her legend grew, though no one dared speak openly. Eleanor's eyes missed nothing, and rumors had a way of reaching her ears before they could do harm. Her greatest triumph, however, lay not in prestige or control over others, it was in the preservation of her own freedom and autonomy. In a world where women, especially enslaved women, were commodities to be owned, traded, or abused, Eleanor had managed to subvert the system entirely. The Caraway plantation thrived not because of Josiah, not because of luck, not because of brute force, but because Eleanor had made it so, and she had done it without ever being recognized as the true architect. Eleanor aged with a grace that belied the burdens she carried. She kept meticulous notes of her strategies, her observations of human behavior, and the subtle manipulations that allowed her to maintain control. These writings, hidden in a chest beneath her modest quarters, would never be discovered by the plantation owners or outsiders. Yet they stood as a testament to her brilliance, a silent archive of domination and survival crafted with patience and intelligence. Even after Josiah's death, the plantation did not falter. Eleanor ensured continuity by cultivating loyalty among key overseers and workers, guiding decisions from the shadows while maintaining the appearance of submission. Her influence endured, and Caraway Plantation became a model of efficiency, almost unnervingly so. Visitors often remarked that something about the place felt different, alive, almost sentient. Some speculated that the estate itself had a consciousness, a guiding hand behind its operations. They were not wrong. By the time Eleanor herself passed quietly in her sleep, the plantation was a testament to her vision. She had outlived the masters who bought and sold her, survived the cruelties and indifference of society, and left behind an estate that functioned perfectly under the logic she alone understood. Tales of her influence and subtle omnipotence began to circulate in whispered legend, spreading to neighboring counties. Some claimed she had been a witch, others that she had made a pact with forces beyond human comprehension. Few questioned the truth. Eleanor had survived, ruled, and shaped the destiny of Caraway Plantation entirely on her own terms. Long after her passing, stories of the woman who was more valuable than any price could measure became part of local folklore. Mothers warned their children to respect the invisible power in quiet observation, to never underestimate those who appeared subservient. Merchants, planters, and neighbors spoke of Caraway's uncanny efficiency in hushed awe. And in the minds of those who had worked there, Eleanor's presence lingered like a shadow, guiding, judging, and ensuring that the plantation continued to operate exactly as she had intended. Her legacy, silent and unyielding, endured far beyond her mortal life. The whispers of Eleanor's authority became the truth of Caraway Plantation. Every corner of the estate, every ledger, every field, every interaction, bore the imprint of her intellect and will. And though the world above saw only a loyal and invaluable servant, history remembered Eleanor as the silent architect of power, the most valuable slave who ever lived, whose cunning and patience transformed an entire plantation into her own kingdom.